Overriding methods. Remember we overrode a method yesterday? Remember that? What method did we override? Anyone remember which one we overrode? It was pretty late. Everyone's brain was like saturated and done. Estimate story points. That's right. We overrode the method. How did we do that? So we had a developer had an implementation of estimate story points, and we wanted the team lead to estimate story points in a different way. John, you remember how we did it?
Yeah, so we also created that.
We created this exact same guy, same signature in team lead. If I put it right over it, you can see they are the same. And then we just gave it a different behavior. So a team lead thinks that something is less complex. For example, 2 points, than a developer. A developer would give it 4 points.
That's an override.
It's an override. So an override means it's got the same signature. It returns the same thing, returns the same type, and it takes the same set of parameters. Right. So if you've got a derived class that overrides a base class, you have the opportunity to change the behavior on one of the methods. Method overriding means we're replacing the base class implementation of the method. So you can't expect we can't expect a team lead to ever do what the developer does and estimate story points, because the team lead does its own thing. Same signature, returns the same type, takes the same parameter types. Here it is, super. The base class constructor can be invoked in a derived class by calling super. Okay, so dog is derived from mammal. You can invoke the constructor of mammal, invoke from dog by using this special term called super. Super calls the constructor of your base class, of your next immediate base class. So if you call super in dog, it invokes the constructor of mammal. It does not automatically invoke the constructor of animal. Dog, if you call super, goes to mammal only. Mammal, if you call super, invokes the constructor of animal. Animal, if you call super, invokes the constructor of object. Object, if you call super, probably doesn't. If you call super from dog, it calls the constructor of mammal. So it creates a mammal. If you want to make a class, you have to call the constructor. If you want to instantiate an object, not if you want to make class, if you want to instantiate an object, you have to call the constructor for that object. And so in order to instantiate a dog, you have to instantiate a mammal, and then that mammal will be a dog. When you instantiate a dog,
Yes.
if you want to explicitly call the constructor for mammal,
You have to and want to.
if you want to, you can. If you don't explicitly call the constructor for mammal, Java will do it itself. If you don't explicitly call the constructor for mammal using super, Java puts that default constructor in, the one with no arguments. And if there's no constructor with no arguments defined on mammal, Java will be like, you're trying to call a constructor that doesn't exist. And that's point 4. So point 3 is it's got to be the first statement in the constructor. Point 4 is it must match the signature of a valid constructor in the base class. So if you try to call super from dog on mammal, and you try to pass it arguments, and there's no constructor on mammal that has that same signature, that has those same arguments, then Java will tell you you can't do it. So Java's always defaulting to the default constructor. The default constructor has no arguments. Okay, let's talk about super. If I want to create a constructor on developer, does anyone remember how to create a, Zach, do you remember how to create a constructor? Nothing. Great. All right. Jamal, let's add some properties. Private. Good?
Yeah.
All right. Now, what if I want to create a developer with a name using a constructor? How could I do that? So Ramya says we're going to do a new one. So let's do Ramya's. All right, then I add a little comfort message, create a developer named name. So look at that. This is overloading the constructor. We've got two signatures on the constructor. One that takes one parameter and one that takes no parameters. So you can create a developer without a name. Maybe I'll put something, creating a developer without a name. And then one that takes a name. So you can overload a constructor. It can take different types and numbers of arguments. Okay, what if I don't want to allow a developer to be created without a name? Without a name. So I only have this one constructor. Right, so if you want to force certain methods, then you can implement an interface. We don't have to do that here. If we want to say that every developer must have a name when you make it, you can just have only this one constructor that has it. I want to add one more element here. Private int age. Okay. Now I want to allow a developer to be created with a name and an age. So I want a constructor that sets both of those. Habib, help me out.
Public developer. This is string name, age. This name, assignment sign name, and this age, assignment sign.
The team lead class, let me go over to that one. Remember, team lead is a derived class from developer. We see it right here. It extends developer, and it's got like all these red squiggly lines under it. All right, so we did not define a constructor for team lead. So, but there is a constructor, but we didn't define it. What is the constructor for team lead if we didn't define it? The default constructor. And what does the default constructor look like? What parameters does the default constructor take? No parameters, right? So I can define it explicitly by adding it here. Public developer, no parameters. Nothing. Default constructor for, I'm sorry, not developer, thank you, team lead. Team lead. All right, this is the only difference between this one and the one that Java creates is I added this little comfort message here. I'm calling these comfort messages because when you call a method, sometimes you want to make sure it was called. So I added this little comfort message here so we feel better, like, oh, that's what I called, okay? But I don't have to add this one. Java, if I don't have any constructors defined, Java will automatically create a default constructor that takes no parameters and does nothing but call super. So what does super refer to then? It refers to the constructor of developer, of the base class. That's why this won't work. So I either need a constructor on developer that takes no parameters, or I need a constructor in team lead that calls an existing defined constructor and developer. So how can I fix this? Add some parameters. You want me to add parameters here in this call to super? Team lead. Cool. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be name. You don't want to call it name. You want it to be name. Okay.
And then you can pass in the side of the super. You can pass the name.
Okay. Right. So when I call the constructor for team lead now, and I pass it a name, it calls the super constructor, which is developer's constructor that takes one string parameter. And so let's go back to that one. Okay. Team lead and Boolean is in the office. Okay. And so you want to right here is in the office. Okay. So super, yeah, if we go back to the rules on calling super, it has to be the first statement of your constructor. So I can't put it before super. So this will work. So now, when you try to instantiate a team lead by calling the constructor, right? You call the constructor, somewhere in our code we'll say new team lead, and then we'll pass it a name, we'll pass it a Boolean. The first thing it'll do it'll create a base class, a developer with that name, and then it will set this other property on team lead. Okay? So now we've got team lead, so looks like we're okay on team lead. Looks like we're okay on developer. Got a problem with architect now. What do you think the problem with architect is? It extends team lead. Yeah, if we want to instantiate an architect, if we call the new keyword to create a new instance of an architect, what constructor will it use on architect? The default constructor, right? And we have not defined it. So what does the default constructor do if you don't define it? Well, it calls super. It calls the default super. It'll call the team lead constructor, right? It'll call the default constructor on team lead, which doesn't exist. Why doesn't it exist? That's right. So we defined a constructor on team lead that wasn't the default constructor. We defined another one. So Java says, oh, you're in the business of defining constructors. I'm not going to create one for you on this class. I'm not going to automatically create a default constructor. So we've got a couple of ways we can handle that. One, we can make Java automatically create that default constructor by getting rid of our other constructor, but we want the other constructor. So the other option is to create the default constructor.
And for you to be able to call super for architect.
That's correct. All right, Bria, define the default constructor on team lead, please. All right, it's hint time from Dan. The default constructor takes no arguments.
Right, okay.
So if you want to, so you want team lead to call super.
So why you want it to, call super?
Okay, so let's go back up to architect. We're trying to instantiate an architect. We don't have a constructor on architect. So we use the default constructor, which Java defines for us. And I'm actually going to define that so we can see what it looks like. So the super constructor on architect is the team lead constructor that takes no parameters. So the team lead constructor that takes no parameters is this one. And that, if we don't define it, would not be defined because we've already defined another constructor on team lead. So we need to define a no parameter constructor. Right. Right. So we've got two ways you can instantiate a team lead. We've got two constructors. We've got one that doesn't take any parameters. We've got one that takes two parameters. So from architect, here we're calling which one? The one that takes no parameters. And then from that constructor, we need to instantiate a developer. So we call the super again. Super now is the constructor for developer. We're calling it with the constructor that takes one parameter. Okay, so if you want to call super from team lead, what class is it instantiating? Yeah. Developer. So how many parameters can you pass to a constructor for developer? One or two. Okay, so if you wanted to, when you create an architect to give the architect a name, how would we do that? When you instantiate an architect, so an architect is a team lead and a team lead is a developer, but you want to instantiate an architect, and when you want the architect to have a name, when you instantiate it, right? So we're going to create an architect Arturo. How can I create an architect with a name? Right now,
You're just creating another constructor
create another constructor.
and create, give it one parameter name, and pass that name to the define over there.
Well,
And that's because we do not have a team lead constructor that just takes a name. So if I add, instead of doing that, instead of going back, we have to call one of the defined team lead constructors. We've got team lead with no parameters and we've got team lead with two parameters. So we have to call one of those. Is in the office and name. All right, all the architects have to be in the office. So, but what'll that do? That'll create a team lead named Bria. And when I do that, it actually creates a developer named Bria. An architect is a team lead. An architect is a developer because a team lead is a developer. Can you create an architect that's just a team lead?
Yeah.
Well, a team lead is a developer, right? So you can't create an architect that is not a developer because of that. You can't create a dog that's not an animal.